It is something that is in you and it is in me. It plays a huge role in everyday life. It always has, and it most likely always will. So why is it that we rarely hear about the mental health gap that exists in the Canadian healthcare system? There is a gap between individuals who need medical attention and those who receive it. A study completed in Ontario in 2004 found that 78.1% of individuals who experience alcohol abuse or alcohol dependence go untreated, as well as 62.3% of individuals who have bipolar disorder and 44.5% of those who suffer from depression, just to name a few. The underlying issue is that many people do not know how to treat the mentally ill. There have been debates for centuries on how to handle and distribute the medical attention they need, between inpatient treatment and outpatient treatment, to thinking their behavior is abnormal, to it being criminal. The healthcare system has been failing the mentally ill for decades, as many of the discharged individuals end up in the justice system, either jail or prison. The big question is, how long does the government think that the healthcare system can pass the burden for responsibility for these individuals onto the justice system before the social structures start to crack? Patients are not getting the treatment they require to get better, nor is the justice system able to function properly with the overcrowding of this population. Who knows? Maybe after this episode, we will gain the attention of government officials who can help us make the changes needed in order to meet the minimal requirements of the mentally ill population. I'm sure many of you are wondering how this issue came to light. Well, taking a quick look at history explains that for us. In the 19th century, the government opted to move to an inpatient treatment method, which means treating a patient in a social institution, such as a mental hospital, a psychiatric ward, or a madhouse, as they called it. The living conditions in these institutions were below average, and the staff members were rarely educated on how to deal with situations or handle the mentally ill. They often turned to violence and abuse in order to contain and control the patients. In the 20th century, during World War II, ethical concerns about the living conditions and treatment experienced in these hospitals arose, and the government quickly opted to move to an outpatient treatment method instead. An outpatient treatment method meant that these individuals would be given their diagnosis, the drugs they needed to treat their symptoms, and then they would be released back into their communities to live their everyday lives while coincidentally caring for themselves. Some issues arose with this outpatient treatment method. The first was that most of these individuals were not capable enough to be handed the responsibility of caring for themselves and administering their own medication. They would often be released and decide they no longer needed to take the medication, so they wouldn't, which led to their symptoms returning along with the abnormal behavior. Another issue that arose is that society started to view the treatment for the psychotropic drugs, aka curative pills, as these individuals being cured, which they were not. They were still sick and they were still suffering. The final issue was that when these individuals were released to live in their communities and they stopped taking their medication and their abnormal behavior returned, they oftentimes landed themselves in prisons or the local jail, which is where they stayed. It was evident by the mid-1970s that deinstitutionalization had taken the responsibilities of the mentally ill away from the healthcare system and placed it onto the justice system, as there was an increased amount of mentally ill in the prison system. When the deinstitutionalization of mental health came the creation of the revolving door policy. This refers to patients getting diagnosed, given their medication, released back into their community with their curative pills, and then readmitted soon after. Although it is argued that since the creation of the revolving door, readmission rates had increased so much so that they make up 55% of all admission rates in Canada. The social evolution of the mentally ill in the justice system evolved through the deinstitutionalization of mental health care and the emptying of hospitals and long-term beds. This movement left these individuals with nowhere to go and no one to rely on except themselves and community attempts at helping them, which were underfunded. So, what do sociologists have to say about the issue? Well, as structural functionalism argues, every part of society works together to function properly. And when one part isn't working the way it is created to, there is a strain on the rest of society. When the government proceeded to dismantle the societal institutions that had previously been created to provide treatment for the mentally ill, the effects were felt throughout society. And today, we can see how the effects of the healthcare system failing to care for the mentally ill has placed a strain on our justice system. Studies show since the emptying of state hospitals, many mentally ill have landed in prisons or local jails, particularly proving that as the hospitals were emptied, there was an increased number of mentally ill individuals in jails or prisons. There was approximately a 36% increase in mentally ill prisoners in county jails alone. A structural functionalist would argue that the shift from inpatient treatment to outpatient treatment had failed society, as it was not functioning properly, and therefore placing a strain on other structures within society, arguing that since the healthcare system is not supporting and treating the mentally ill, the burden of that responsibility has been placed onto justice systems. It is important to note that a functionalist theorist would argue that society would not be stable again until the healthcare system worked properly and took back the responsibility of caring and treating the mentally ill. The conflict theory argues that economic and political structures of a society create multiple divisions, inequalities, and conflicts. It is argued that the scarcity of services in much of the world play a huge role in who goes untreated. 70% of the global population lives within access of one psychiatrist to 100,000 people. Could you imagine trying to book an appointment with a psychiatrist and being told there are 100,000 other people in front of you? It is not a realistic functioning ratio, but why is it that low? Well, a conflict theorist would critique the fact that deinstitutionalization drew support from fiscal conservatives interested primarily in saving government funds by shutting the state hospitals. A conflict theorist would say that this decision was based on the support of upper-class individuals who have health coverage and could afford to pay for a private institution if needed be. Whereas most of America did not have health coverage, and many individuals depended on those state-run hospitals if they or their loved ones required mental health assistance. A conflict theorist would argue that the decision to close these hospitals comes from a political structure that creates inequalities for the lower class, whom did not have the same access to healthcare coverage as the upper class. Dr. James Stubblebine was discussed in Tory's article in 2010. Dr. Stubblebine was the director of the California Department of Mental Health. He was asked about the problem of the number of mentally ill individuals ending up in prisons, and he stated, and I quote, "Specific information is not available which would indicate that more discharged patients are going into jails," although this was a lie. As at the time he stated this, he had 2 studies that contradicted this statement, and soon after he had a third. It is also important to note that Dr. Stubblebine was an avid supporter of emptying the hospitals. A conflict theorist would argue that Dr. Stubblebine is an example of someone using their political and economic power to support a movement that creates inequality within society, and most likely for personal financial gain. Regarding psychotropic drugs, a conflict theorist would argue that big pharmaceutical companies use these curative pills to make a huge profit. They promoted using these pills in mental hospitals, which played a huge role in the formation of the public policy opinions and placement options that are available in the communities. They would argue that these companies are exploiting the mentally ill population so that they can gain massive financial. Overall, a conflict theorist would argue that individuals with high political and economic power are using mental illness to make a profit or save government funds without paying attention to the disaster it has caused for the mentally ill patients. They would say that these upper-class individuals or groups, like big pharma companies, are exploiting this population to make money, and they did so through deinstitutionalization, regardless that it caused many of these individuals to go untreated and end up in state prisons or local jails. After hearing about these issues, a lot of people wonder what the future holds. Frankly, the future of mental health care, the way it's going right now, is not looking good. The revolving door will spin faster and more patients will be released and readmitted rather than get the medical attention they need. The safety and stability of our mental ill population depends on our healthcare system getting a reboot and creating a system that works for the patients as well as the government. If the mental healthcare system does not improve, it only means more of the mentally ill population will end up in prisons or jails. 16% of the total prison population in the United States are prisoners who suffer from a serious mental illness. And a study shows that a mentally ill individual is 3 times more likely to end up in jail or prison than to end up in a hospital. Another risk that runs with this mental health care gap is the stigma that exists because of it. Symptoms that an individual is mentally ill has begun to be seen as criminal behavior, which again leads to them being locked up, although these individuals just need to be treated to function normally in everyday society. In order to save the future of these individuals, we must give them a fair shot at life. If we continue down the path we are on, many members within society will slowly start to fade into the dark corners of a prison or jail cell, while coincidentally lacking the treatment they need in order to get better. The most obvious innovation that needs to occur is a reboot in the current healthcare system, particularly in the way the mentally ill are being pushed aside. My argument here is not that the outpatient treatment is bad and that it needs to be demolished, but perhaps with a few upgrades it could work perfectly for some individuals. Sociologists suggest that perhaps assisted outpatient treatment would be a better alternative. This way, we can ensure that all the mentally ill individuals who are being released are also still receiving the treatment they need in order to prevent a relapse. Maybe by making it a condition of the release that they have to take their medications and they must go in for counseling or checkups once or twice a week. Small innovations like these will help us monitor them, and we can continue to work with them on getting better. Another possibility for innovation, as Torrey suggests in his article, is using mental health courts more often. Mental health courts have specifically trained court officials, a specific judge, a specific crown, mental health court workers, and on-site psychiatrists to deal with the mentally ill. And they often give the offenders the choice between following a treatment plan or going to jail. They are designed to deal with mentally ill patients in a mature understanding and with complete sensitivity to the situation. Studies in the United States state that these courts prove to be very effective, although some mental health courts are only opened once a week or once every 2 weeks, and they are scarcely located in Canada. The use of these courts would assist in keeping the mentally ill population out of our justice system by giving them a fair trial and the option between jail and treatment. In regards to learning from other countries, the most admirable area we could learn from is the European countries. Studies have found that there is an inverse relationship between imprisonment and mental hospitalization rates, meaning that there is no relationship between the two. It is suggested that this is because of the wide availability of resources in order to assist individuals with mental illness. Perhaps, if Canada took value in the European system, we could learn how to improve our own by making resources largely available across our country, in hopes that the relationship between our imprisonment and mental hospitalizations would also work towards an inverse relationship. In conclusion, the Canadian healthcare system definitely has a far way to go when it comes to dealing with the mentally ill. But with proper funding and research into what would better our system, we could have all aspects of our society working properly again. Thanks for listening to my concerns on our healthcare system.